You can continue asking Jinsun on the chat if you have any more questions. I'm just gonna while you're doing that, let me just introduce our next session for today. Your data model, what lies beneath your BI apps and AI and more. Our speaker is Sanjiv Venkatram. He's a Microsoft MVP for business apps. He's a very good friend of the data platform user group, Singapore Data Platform user group. Used to be very active on our side until I think he fell in love with Power Apps. Uh, I'm gonna pass him the control.
Um, Thank you very much, Pio. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we
Wonderful.
can hear Sanjeev.
Wonderful, Pio, Aro. Let me do this. Let me kindly share my screen and then we'll get started. First of all, I just wanted to say it is such a pleasure to be here. You know, as Pio kindly said, you know, we've been associated with, how do you say, the data side of the house since probably about 4 years now, you know, coming up on 4 years. And in the heart of hearts, we always wanted to actually like say, extend the outreach beyond the confines of Singapore. It is amazing work from Pio, Aro, Asif, Shailendra, and a few others from the community to have this day. This is unbelievable, you know, to actually see people from, you know, Mr. Kim from South Korea, Mr. Pastor from, you know, I assume it is the Philippines. It is remarkable, you know. So kudos to you. Huge round of applause to the organizers for making this happen, you know. From also, I would just like to call everybody out. You know, it's a Saturday. It's everybody is with family and things like that. So it means a lot for you to come here and give us the time of the day. So two fantastic presentations. The first one, you know, it's how do you say? So many questions about that. We'll take it with ML, I suppose, later. But thank you for giving us the time. So what I thought I'd do, and this is how do you say, you know, about 4 or 5 years ago, and I have my good friend, I can see Naginder here on Teams, and he can keep me honest actually. About 4, 5, or maybe almost 6 years ago, you know, what I had seen was actually from the viewpoint, you know, one viewpoint, if you will, of one user, right? As I was in corporate finance within Microsoft, and my viewpoint was actually from that perspective about data, right? It was about that one perspective. And just from my own experience, I knew that there was how do you say, a significant gap, if you will, in terms of where the end users are and the needs of the end users, if you will, if I were to put myself in that shoes, versus, you know, how do you say, the institution of like, you know, database management, be it either DBAs or like developers. I mean, there is the possibilities, if you will, from my perspective was massive. And, you know, being with people like Naginder, being with people like, you know, folks in the data community, Pio, Aro, Dharmendra, etc., it actually opened my eyes to, wow, there is so much actually, you know, possible if people actually come together, if they make the effort to, you know, reach out to folks on either ends. There is so much that is actually possible, right? And when you consolidate all of that, right? I mean, yes. So that's like the preamble with which I said, you know, let's actually talk about like this whole thing about the data model and understand not just about how do you say BI and apps and you know what ML talked about, you know, AI, but also the broader context of where all these actually come from and you know the conversations that we need to actually be having with different people across the organization, you know. So, I'm suffice it to say, Priyo had some kind words. I'm just a community user. That's who I am, right? And that's about the long and short of it. The rest is all, how do you say, embellishments. So from an agenda perspective, for me, it was the desperate need, as I have in the last 1.5 years, 1 year about actually started my own little, like tiny little gig, right? And reached out to, I'll be honest, I've had over, 2 dozen sort of trainings. We are actually doing some consulting work for about, half a dozen customers. We are doing quite a number of projects as well. And these are primarily actually have been initiated by people who are, let us say, end users, is kind of the place I would actually put them, be it either folks who are on the HR side who are actually looking at internship metrics, be it either operations people in, like, let's say, a university industry partnership, let us say, people in operations who are actually looking at performance of the different companies that do business with the universities, if they're looking at something like that with surveys. You could look at people who are actually on the finance side, who are either on the accounting side, who are actually on the financial planning side, people like that. And actually on the engineering side, and this is non-IT engineering, I'm talking about people who are in production, people who are in design engineering, things of that nature, right? As we have done projects, done consulting work with, folks like that. And this is not just across, like, smaller firms. We have MNCs, like US MNCs actually, who are massive in size, right? And, you folks know this, if you look at just their dimension table could be of the order of like 25, 30 million rows, So you're talking about those kind of people, as well as actually, like, the, how do you say, the mom and pop shops, right? As you talk through all of this, the one thing you see is the massive, it's a chasm, it's all I can say. It's the chasm of a gap between what those people are actually faced with and what is actually support coming their way. Let me put it this way, right? Just about, in December or so, we started a tiny little production project. Okay, it's from an app perspective, it's actually a little complex, but the thing is, from the timeline perspective, it's actually a relatively small project. It has taken us about 2 months to actually get a SQL Server actually provisioned from the customer side. This is an MNC, to actually for us to, move our environment over to theirs, right? And so, and this is because the project has actually been initiated by the, how do you say, the production engineers from that team, because they had a desperate need. And then they had to, like, circle through many, many layers within IT, including, how do you say, shared services and things like that, in order for us to get to where we have to get to, right? So that is, if you will, the need for outreach. So, when I look at this community as an example, what I'm trying to do from my side is to get these end users, if you will, to come into these communities. Yes, some of this is going to go over their heads, right? I mean, as an example, the previous session, right? It may not be directly, if you will, actually applicable, maybe the machine learning so, but the previous session may be, oriented towards DBAs. But the point is you get exposure, right? The point is you get exposure. That has been, how do you say, the desperate need, if you will, to bring. One of the reasons why I went over to the Power App side is because, they're talking about, end user, space, if you will, be it either Power BI or Power Platform, the end users, democratization and things of that nature. So my hope is through that actually start pulling people into the data community, right? I mean, because there are some end users who actually show up there, push them over to the data community and make it bigger. I just wanted to give you one sobering statistic, folk, right? And I'm sorry to, how do you say so much about, the user base and the community. If you take about the number of people, 1% of the number of people who are between the age group of 25 to 55, right? Essentially, you could say the active working community, 25 to 60 or 55, 1% of it across ASEAN, that is 2.5 million people. 2.5 million people. And if I go over to Teams right now, right, I go to Teams and I look at how many people are there right now in the, in our talk right now. There are 22 of us, right? So that, if you will, is actually the immense opportunity for us to reach out, to bring people to bear, because trust me, if someone like me can be doing all this, I'm sure, like, other people who are more talented than me can actually do a lot more, contribute a lot more. Okay. So that is, how do you say, please reach out, whichever organizations you're in, kindly reach out to, how do you say, the business side, kindly invite the business side over. If you have friends who are in other places, kindly reach out to them and ask them to, bring, how do you say, people over. All you need is like, like some 10 people, you start with like a small base, and the next thing, you have like at least about 250, 300 people who will actually be interested in doing something like this, right? The second thing was, as we go through, for me, back at Microsoft in corporate finance, initially from about 2008 is when I actually started there in Redmond, till about 2014 or 15. If you were to actually go over to your Excel, right? If you were to actually go over to your Excel, there was a tab like so for, how do you say, there was a tab where you could actually go pull whatever fields you want, whatever dimensions and measures you want, and you click a button, and that would actually come into, your Excel as a flat table or as a pivot table, from which you actually use, you have multiple pivot tables out here. I'm not kidding. This is real, huh? So, you had multiple pivot tables, and initially you would actually use a whole bunch of Visual Basics, code to change the filters in the pivot table to add a, a summary out here, let us say, a summary view to make your reporting, right? And this is, I'm not talking about like, a small company somewhere on the other side of the world. This is Microsoft I'm talking about, So that, if you will, was kind of the journey. And about 6 years ago, and Naginder, kindly correct me if I'm wrong, it was about 6 years ago or so, Microsoft came up with this thing. It's just a cube. It's basically a SQL Server analysis cube, like called KPI Lake, which had about 1,500 KPIs, and then tons and tons and tons of data inside off of it, right? So there, and this was all curated cube, you had your dimensions and measures perfectly actually laid out. But I just wanted to give you an idea of how I would actually use something like that. And you can see the pitfalls in that, right? As database administrators, as people who are the, how shall I say, the guardians, if you will, of data. I can show you as to how I used to actually use that, and you can actually see the pitfalls there in terms of how somebody who's not experienced in creating these data models can actually, like, create issues, if you will, in performance. Okay. As an example, I have a very simple training, whatever, Power BI out here. I've got a transaction table with a bunch of transactions. It's got products, segments, how do you say, quantity, so on and so forth. The key component of this is that this particular table actually comes from Common Data Service, or CDS. If I go to data source settings, there are two. One is Excel to use to do the master table. I've done something with an Excel, but then I have my Common Data Service, or what do you call that, Dataverse, right? So one of these is actually from Dataverse, right? So I've got this data from there, and I've built out a very simple model, right? It takes literally like, 5 minutes to cobble something like this up, right? And then it follows, if you will, your traditional star schema, so on and so forth. You could actually, like, snowflake it, whatever else, But the thing is, it's a simple little model. Now, what I used to do was, this is published on powerbi.com, right? It's published on powerbi.com. As you know, you folks can actually access that in Excel. All I've done is I've, like, just brought it into DAX Studio, right? Which I'm sure, everyone here is actually aware of it, given your DBA background, right? So I've actually got it into DAX Studio. So the point here is that, what I used to do was just imagine that instead of the Power BI model, it's essentially a, how do you say, a surrogate, if you will, of the analysis services cube. So this DAX Studio pretty much gives me the same thing. So what I would do is I would actually go up here in Power Pivot. So this is Excel, and then I go to Power Pivot, right? If there are end users out here, sorry to jump ahead a little bit in the interest of time. So I literally go to my Power Pivot here, go to manage, and then this in-memory SQL, right? If I go up here, I have this analysis services, I can actually, I used to, because that was an analysis services cube. So I used to go up here and access this analysis services cube out here. Now I just have my existing connection here to the ODC, so I can just open this up. So what I would do literally is open this up, and then you obviously like you're authenticated, and then it would give me this designer, if you will, right? Where you guys know this better than me, perhaps. You actually go in and write up your MDX query to actually pull data, but I didn't do that. So what I would do is I would actually use this design view out here that would actually give me complete control of what I really want to do within the context of a particular region, because KPI Lake was an ocean, as you can imagine, right? It was an ocean. So I didn't want to port all of the unnecessary data that I, didn't want. So I would just say, hey, look, these are the measures. If I look at the measures over here, I've got my, let us say, reported sales to Accra in Singapore. So I have my prior year revenue, and then maybe I can bring in my local sales as well if I'm reporting in Malaysia, to their finance agencies, so I can bring all that. And then perhaps I could also get the year-on-year growth, right? I mean, all of these have actually been defined out here in the data model, right? I mean, all my DAX queries are all simple stuff, right? So I've got my measures out here, and you can just imagine, right? You can have as many, like, the 1500 KPIs, right? So you can eat your heart out in terms of measures. I mean, this would be 1500 rows, right? So basically you have your measures out here. Then I go to my, let's say, date table, and I say, I need what is like my year, and I need my, how do you say, month year, which I have like, a curated data set. This is a curated data set, right? In Power BI, I built out a proper date table from the transaction table. So it is, how do you say, live all the time, as transactions come in, those get updated automatic, all that good stuff, right? So I'm accessing something that, let us say, Mr. P.O. Balastoy from the administration standpoint has worked and created this, how do you say, whole cube, right? So that's what I mean, right? So I'm accessing it as an end user, I'm accessing this cube to make my own data set, right? To make my own data set, I can go to location out here, I can pull out the country, then I can actually pull out, let's say, the region, so on and so forth, right? And then maybe I can go to product, maybe add a product right here, blah, 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 right? So I can just keep defining things like so, a segment, so on and so forth. Then if I actually say, okay, it comes up with this, how do you say, behind the scenes MDX query for me. And then I can actually like, bring all of this data in now into Power Query, right? So out here, it's gotten X amount of data into Power Query. The rest of the story should be fairly actually familiar to you. If I got my, how do you say, diagram view out here, right? And from here, I could, I could literally build out, right? I could build out more, how do you say, dimension tables or master tables from here. As an example, I could just go across to my Excel and then add like a few master tables here from Excel for something more over and beyond what Mr. P.O. Balastoy is actually giving me, right? His data set is the curated, data set like KPI Lake as an example that the organizations actually develop. And I go in and I actually pull this data set into this designer, into, how do you say, this table. I add a whole bunch of like other tables and I create my own relationships, etc., and come up with something that mimics, if you will, a star schema, right here. And then what I would do is I would actually go up, and instead of actually putting it down as a pivot table, I would actually put it down as a flattened pivot table, right? A flattened pivot table is basically nothing more than just, plain old normalized data that is, how do you say, in one particular place. And I would just go up here and then say, I want all these like so, right? Boom, boom, like that, right? So now I have created a flattened data set. And then, if I've had like other, dimension tables on top of this, all of this would actually appear here. From here, the story, right? From here, the story. I can save this, I mean, I can actually access this within Power BI and then build out a whole, how do you say, BI on top of this and then publish it to wherever I want. So what I've done here is that even though IT has actually given me this data model, right? Let us say, somebody in between the database administrators and then the BI development team has gone in and built out, let us say a data set like the KPI lake, right? So where they've gone in and, brought in many, how do you say, master tables, so on and so forth, and then, brought this data model up. Then for me as an end user, I have, created my own little sort of like, how do you say, data set out here, which is a flattened, table that I can actually import into, right? So, from your standpoint, and the reason why I do this, is if I want more control over the master tables where I want, it happens, it used to happen all the time at Microsoft, somebody actually says, hey, look, combine this cloud with this cloud and show me the performance, right? And this is literally live. Well, I cannot go back to Mr. Pierre Balastoy and then say, hey, my sales guy is asking for this custom taxonomy. Now go away, create it. And by the way, you need to give it to me within the next 5 minutes. He'll ask me to take a hike, basically. It's impossible, right? Impossible to do, but that is life. That is real life. And that's what I'm actually faced with customers, right? Yesterday, I was at a university where there was some conversation with the second layer, the deputy, how do you say, the director of the whatever institute that reports to the principal. The guy was screaming. I mean, he was literally screaming at the people. I could hear it from outside the door saying, I don't give a damn, what it takes. I want this right now, right? I mean, the guy is like losing his mind. That is reality, is what we are actually faced with, right? So then what do? Right? I cannot go back to Mr. Naginder Singh. I cannot go back to Mr. P.O. Balstoy to say, hey, look, give me that curated data set. I have to do it here on my own. And if I were to do this flattened pivot table, now this is a small little table, right? And everybody understands this. This is a small, tiny little table. So, when I fire queries in Power BI against these measures, right? Let us say I've got my sales over here. I've got my prior year sales. This year-on-year growth, as an aggregation will not make sense. So I'll actually go create something on my own. But the point is, once I have this and I actually put it up there in Power BI, well, if this is a smaller data set, then there is not much of a difference, if you will, in aggregate. Even if you take a simple command like summing, right? Like summing, or even distinct counts, as a distinct count may be a different story. But the thing is, if you have these, measures that you put in, if the data set is small, of course, there is no difference between your star schema and using a flattened table like this, right? But then if I start adding more and more and more data, like I used to, let us say at Microsoft, and then if I had, I did that when I was here in APAC. Just imagine if I had done it when I was in actually Redmond, right? The amount of delays it would have caused in performance, because I'm actually operating, like if I fire a query, it has to actually search the entire fact table over here for it to retrieve like a distinct count, let us say, of one particular column. Whereas if I do the same thing in my, how do you say, start schema, or even like, how do you say, the snowflake schema, then, the performance results are going to be fairly different in terms of the time, right? Now, as an end user, right, I am being thrown into this place where I have to do all this, right? That is life, right? Be it either in HR, people who are in HR doing surveys, people either who are in payroll, people who are in finance, it is life, right? This is what I face every single day, right? When I go out there, I see people who are being asked to do this. If they don't have a view of a difference between creating, let's say, a flattened pivot table versus actually creating a star schema, or even the concept of slow flaking, let us say, we are short, right? I mean, they will suffer. And at the end of the day, guess what's going to happen? They're just going to turn around and say, Power BI is actually slow, right? So the idea behind getting them to understand the differences, maybe trying shoot this across to Power BI, build a data model out of it, bring it, to your DAX queries, see the difference in performance between a flattened pivot table and let us say your star schema for yourself, as you do it for yourself. And I actually see my good friend, just a few minutes ago, I saw my good friend Aziz over here. I'm not sure if Mr. Aziz is there. He's from finance, right? If you do that, if you were to actually do that for yourself, you'll realize, I need to look at all this in a different way. Not just that, I need to reach out to somebody who has a lot of depth in this area, who would that be? It would be Mr. P.O. Balastoy, right? It would actually be, Naginder Singh, let us say. It would actually be, someone who's on the database side. Then you reach out to them, go take them out for a lunch or something like that, and tell them what you're trying to do. The person himself or herself may not be able to do it for you. Obviously, they have like 100 other things to take care of. But the one thing they actually tell you, hey, go and look at like what the star schema thing is and actually build out a schema for yourself. If they tell you that one little thing, trust me, you will actually go very far, right? So that is, if you will, on the BI side, right? That is on, if you will, the BI and the database side too. I mean, database said, you've literally made your own little database out here, right? And it could be little, it could be large. Just depends on what you're trying to do. That's the scary part. It could actually be large, right? It could actually be large. And that's the scary part. And your own, you're digging your own grave in terms of performance, when you're doing things like this, right? So that is, if you will, on like, the shadow, if I were to call it the shadow database side, and then the shadow BI, the BI is real, the shadow database side is how I would call it. So that is on this side. The other side of the house, the same exact person, right? The same exact finance person or the HR person would be designing, how do you say, a forecast or designing a, let us say, a survey, right? As an example, the HR person wants to design a survey to get all the inputs for the Ministry of Education from an internship performance of, like, let us say, the universities in Singapore, let us say, right? Vis-a-vis the companies that they actually deal with. Now enter like this lovely power apps, right? In the whole concept of the democratization, well, end users can actually go in and build their own apps as well. As an example, out here, it's the same exact data set now, right? So it's got the same country, like it's got Singapore, it's got products out here, it's got segments, right? It's got segments. And then you basically go in and actually like say, okay, I've got this information out here. I'm going to submit this information, right? So this information now gets submitted to the backend database. And then lo and behold, this line item is actually created up here. Well, guess what? You run into issues right here, right here at the very front. As an end user, you run into an issue because in this case, they're using, let us say, Dataverse, right? Tables out here. Dataverse is actually not too bad. It like takes care of most of our crimes. It actually it's very kind to our crimes, right? As end users. So if I go to, let's say, the fact sales table out here, so, I've got a whole bunch of data types out here. Some of are actually like lookups as an example. If I want in this whole case, I've got this amount out here. It's actually in local currency, right? It could be in Malaysian ringgit, right? So this lookup table would actually pull the respective exchange rate, and in the actual data in the facts table in the background, it would actually do the automatic conversion. There are also things like, creating keys and so on and so forth. It allows you to do all that fairly elegantly, as opposed to actually having to go to Mr. P.O. Balastoy and then saying, hey, look, create this entire, data model for me. The danger here, and the danger here is, I may not even think through the fact that I need my master tables, right? I may not even think through. So the same exact data model that I have on the BI side, I need the same exact thing out here on my app side as well. You would actually be surprised, right? You go talk to somebody who's deep into Dynamics 365 as an example, and ask them about, hey, look, in this environment, I actually want to see the star schema. They may be lost. They actually may be lost as to tell you as to, well, how the relationships actually go. Of course, you can see the relationships out here in Dataverse, but the thing is, in terms of seeing that elegant model that we actually saw within either Power Query or Power BI or in SQL Server, well, in Management Studio, well, you don't actually get that out here. So much so that me as an end user, right? Me as an end user, I'm doing this stuff where I'm actually developing this application that inputs data. This is transactional data, okay? This is transactional data. But tomorrow, if Mr. Naginder comes and says, hey, look, I want you to add another segment out here beyond enterprise, let us say consumer segment, I'm lost. I'm lost. I don't know what the hell to do, because I don't have an application that is an administration application that would actually go put the data into the respective master table, and thereby furnish this information in your fact table so that you can actually access it elegantly within your application. You follow me, right? So that whole concept of data model resides deeply here as well, and it's extremely connected to, how do you say, our BI, especially in the case of end users who are doing the 360 degree, right? They're doing 360 degree. They are not like Uber database admins who only do database work, or Uber application developers who only do applications. And then, it's like, how do you say, traveling in India, right? People come from all sides, so they don't actually, when they meet in the middle, there's a massive, right? So they don't, right? Because they have to do both, right? They have to do both applications on the one side with Power Apps. They have to build the BI with the data that have actually entered into the system. Well, guess what? If you don't have a proper data model and the thinking around the data model with star schema, things of that nature, well, guess what? We are screwed, right? We are absolutely screwed. The same thing applies on the AI side as well, right? As an example, if I just go over to my LinkedIn out here, it's just a very simple example, right? A very simple example. And this is the reason, I actually do my posts is for, people who are in that space, who are end users, right? I'll give you a brief one. Okay, I go to my posts out here. If I scroll down, um, this guy, right? So this thing is a Power BI tile that's actually on Power Apps, right? It's a Power BI tile, and I'm using it as a presentation, basically, right? If you notice, the keywords here came from all your kind feedback. So of all the, like 24 trainings that I did last year, so there was a whole slew of one whole row of comments. Well, I used Microsoft Forms for it. I connected it to the database and then, ported it to Power BI, one column of all these comments. Then I connected it to cognitive services. Now, there are elements, within text analytics to actually see whether the quality of it. What we didn't talk about, like, one, presentation before, is how do you judge the quality of the AI that actually comes out, right? So convergence and things of that nature. But out here, when I saw the output and when I compared it actually with the verbatim comments, they were okay. They were reasonably okay. So then I was able to actually take that and then put it into, how do you, a presentation layer. But that column actually resides, if you will, within the fact table, right? It actually lives within the fact table. And if I want to do something with it, with keys and so on and so forth, I could actually go, do a hash key, or like, whatever it is that I have to do, I could actually do that, right? So in the net summary, it is not just about your, BI, it is not just about your AI, or it is not just about your applications. What lies underneath is critical, super important for us to actually be, how do you say, success is a broad word, but I would rather actually use that to be successful, and in especially in terms of performance, and especially in terms of executives. If executives lack one thing, that's time, right? So in order for us to give them back that, it is super important for us to take care of that data model, right? Be it either, whether it's star schema, you're snowflaking, whatever else, that concept needs to reside. If you're going to democratize applications, if you're going to democratize BI, if you're going to democratize AI, please democratize the data model concept as well. Otherwise, you will have a mess all over the place. Good for me, because I get business out of it, where I, like a small little team, we go in and actually like help people. But that's not the promise of democratization. We need to take care of that, right? So that is the net summary, if you will, of the conversation. Is please reach out to your brothers and sisters who are in your organizations as end users. Please invite them to maybe lunch and learns or something like that. Walk them through what these things are in terms of like what lies beneath the data model, your structure. Please walk them through that, so that people who are actually democratizing apps and BI are able to understand the fundamentals, and not just go with, like, let us say, hey, look, I'm just going to throw up a bunch of data to Power BI and I'll have some pretty pictures, okay? With this, I will stop here. I will hand it back to PO. I suppose I'm actually on time, so I'll hand it back to PO. And if you have any questions, kindly do reach out, please.
Oh, I'm in mute. I was already. Yeah, I was just saying it was a great discussion, and I just want to make a shout out. Who says Excel is not a database because you just saw what he showed and what you can do. Yeah.
But I just want to point out, please, kindly, Excel is great, but Excel is also not a database, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so let us be very clear. And then, yes, you can actually get that beautiful designer and do stuff, but before we do stuff, PO has to educate the public, right? PO has to educate the public, saying, "Hey guys, have you thought about your start schema? Have you thought about your things like that before we?" I'm sorry to underline it because this is real. This is what we
Mhm.
face day in day out. So back to you, PO. I'll like 2 o'clock up on time. Handle
Yeah,
it.
right on time. Thanks,
Yeah,
Sanjeev.
most
If you
welcome,
have
sir.
any more questions or if you wanna continue the discussion, you can do it on the chat or you can reach out to Sanjeev. It's a great discussion to have because it's happening every day in the business. So let me just quick.